The morning fog hung low over Cedar Falls, Virginia, clinging to the streets like a gray blanket reluctant to let go. It was the kind of small town where everybody knew everybody, where secrets lasted about as long as it took to walk from the hardware store to the diner on Main Street. Population 8,000 and change, nestled in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, close enough to Washington, D.C. to feel its influence, but far enough away to maintain its own identity. Frank Morrison pulled his Kenworth into the gravel lot behind his house just as the first rays of sunlight broke through the mist. He had been driving for 16 hours straight, hauling lumber from a mill in North Carolina, and every bone in his 54-year-old body ached with a familiar weariness. But there was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from honest work, and Frank had never been afraid of that. He climbed down from the cab, his boots crunching on the gravel, and stood for a moment looking at the house he had called home for 23 years. It was nothing fancy, just a two-story colonial with white siding and green shutters, but it was paid off, and it was his. Margaret had loved that house, had tended the garden out back until the cancer took her 7 years ago. Now it was just Frank and his daughter Lily, navigating life together as best they could. The back door opened and Lily appeared, her auburn hair catching the morning light, a coffee mug in each hand. She was 20 years old, home from Virginia Tech for the summer, working at the town library to save money for her senior year. She had her mother's smile, warm and genuine, and seeing it always made Frank's heart swell with pride and grief in equal measure. "Hey, Dad," Lily said, descending the porch steps to meet him. "Long haul?" Frank accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his calloused hands around the warm ceramic. The longest. Got stuck behind an accident outside of Roanoke for 3 hours. "How's everything here?" Lily shrugged, leaning against the truck's massive front tire. "Same old. Mrs. Patterson's cat got stuck in the oak tree again. Sheriff Willis had to bring out the ladder. It was the most excitement this town has seen in weeks." Frank chuckled, sipping his coffee. "That cat's going to give that poor woman a heart attack one of these days." They walked inside together, and Frank settled into his worn recliner while Lily made breakfast. The smell of bacon and eggs filled the small kitchen, mixing with the coffee aroma to create something that felt like home. Frank closed his eyes for just a moment, letting the exhaustion wash over him. "Dad!" Lily's voice pulled him back. "You okay?" "Just tired, sweetheart. Nothing a shower and a few hours of sleep won't fix." Lily brought him a plate and sat across from him at the kitchen table, her own breakfast untouched. There was something in her eyes, something she was not saying. Frank had learned to read his daughter over the years, had become both mother and father to her after Margaret's passing. He knew when something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked, setting down his fork. Lily hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "It's nothing. Really, just, there's been some talk around town, that's all." "What kind of talk?" "Senator Whitmore's son is back for the summer. Bradley. He's been causing some trouble." Frank's jaw tightened. Senator Richard Whitmore was Cedar Falls' most famous resident, a 3-term United States senator with ambitions for the White House. He had grown up in this town, had built his political career on his small-town roots and common man image. But Frank had known Richard Whitmore since they were boys, had seen the arrogance beneath the folksy charm, and he had heard stories about Bradley, the senator's only child, a 22-year-old who had never been told no in his life. "What kind of trouble?" Frank asked carefully. Lily shook her head. He's been drinking a lot, being aggressive with people. He got into a fight at Mulligan's bar last week, broke a guy's nose, but of course nothing happened. Sheriff Willis let him go with a warning. Frank felt the familiar frustration rising in his chest. Cedar Falls had always been divided into 2 classes, the Whitmores and everyone else. The family owned half the town, employed a quarter of its residents, and donated generously to every local cause. In return, they expected deference, and they usually got it. "You stay away from him," Frank said firmly. "Bradley Whitmore is bad news, always has been. Dad, I'm 20 years old. I can take care of myself. I know you can, sweetheart. But promise me anyway. Lily rolled her eyes but nodded. I promise. Now eat your breakfast before it gets cold. Frank finished his meal and headed upstairs to shower and sleep. But even as exhaustion pulled him under, he could not shake the unease that had settled in his stomach. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, the way he could feel a storm approaching on the open road. He just did not know how bad the storm would be. 3 days later, Frank was in the garage, changing the oil on his pickup truck, when he heard a car pull into the driveway. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked around front to find Sheriff Tom Willis stepping out of his cruiser, his face grave beneath the brim of his tan hat. "Tom!" Frank said, his stomach dropping. "What is it?" Sheriff Willis was a good man, had been friends with Frank for over 30 years. They had played football together in high school, had stood as best men at each other's weddings. But right now, Tom Willis looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the world. "Frank," he said slowly, "there's been an incident. It's Lily." The world seemed to tilt beneath Frank's feet. He grabbed the garage doorframe to steady himself. "What happened? Where is she?" "She's at the hospital, County General. She's going to be okay, Frank. She's going to be okay, but—" Tom took a deep breath. Bradley Whitmore assaulted her. Last night, outside the library after her shift, she fought back, got away, but he hurt her pretty bad. Broken wrist, some bruises. She's shaken up, but she's going to be okay. Frank felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, replacing the warm blood that had been there moments before. "Bradley Whitmore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Senator Whitmore's son." Tom nodded, his eyes filled with something that looked like shame. "I know what you're thinking, Frank, and I want you to know that I'm going to handle this by the book. Bradley is in custody right now. We're pressing charges, assault and battery. In custody," Frank repeated. "For how long, Tom? Until his daddy makes a phone call? Until the family lawyers show up?" Tom Willis did not answer, which was answer enough. Frank pushed past him, heading for his truck. "I need to see my daughter." "Frank, wait!" Tom grabbed his arm. "Before you go, there's something else you should know. The Whitmores are already circling the wagons. Their lawyer called the station an hour ago, talking about how Lily provoked Bradley, how she's making false accusations. They're going to try to make this go away." Frank turned to face his old friend, and something in his eyes made Tom Willis take a step back. "Let them try," Frank said quietly. "Let them try." County General Hospital was 30 miles outside Cedar Falls, a sprawling complex that served the entire region. Frank broke every speed limit getting there, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his mind racing with images he could not control. Lily was in a private room on the 3rd floor, her left arm in a cast, her face pale against the white hospital pillows. There were bruises on her cheek and neck, purple shadows that made Frank's blood boil. But her eyes were clear, and when she saw him she tried to smile. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice hoarse. "You should see the other guy." Frank crossed the room in 2 strides and gathered her gently in his arms, careful not to jostle her injured wrist. "Baby girl," he whispered. I'm so sorry I wasn't there. It's not your fault, Dad." Lily pulled back, wiping her eyes with her good hand. "I was closing up the library, and he was waiting outside. He'd been drinking, he started saying things, and when I tried to walk away, he grabbed me. I fought back, like you taught me. Got him good in the face before he broke my wrist." Frank felt tears streaming down his face, but he did not bother to wipe them away. "You're the bravest person I know," he said. "You hear me?" "The bravest?" Lily nodded, but there was fear in her eyes, fear that should not be there. "Dad," she said quietly, "his lawyer was already here, before you came. He said I should think carefully about pressing charges. He said the Whitmores could make things very difficult for us. He said nobody would believe a trucker's daughter over a senator's son." Frank felt the cold, hard thing in his chest turn to ice. "He said that? The lawyer said that to you?" "He didn't come out and say it exactly, but I knew what he meant." Lily's voice wavered. "Dad, I'm scared, not of Bradley, of what comes next. The Whitmores own this town. They can destroy us. Frank sat down on the edge of the bed, taking his daughter's good hand in both of his. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "Nobody is going to destroy us, and nobody is going to sweep this under the rug. What Bradley Whitmore did to you was wrong, and he's going to answer for it. I don't care who his father is. But, Dad, no buts." Frank squeezed her hand. "I've spent my whole life being invisible to people like the Whitmores. Just another working man they don't have to see. But they're going to see me now. They're going to see us. And they're going to learn that Frank Morrison doesn't back down from a fight." Lily studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, Dad. Okay. What do we do?" "First," Frank said, "we get you home and rested. Then we find ourselves a lawyer, a real one, not someone who'll roll over for the Whitmores. And then we fight." The next few days were a blur of activity. Frank brought Lily home from the hospital and set her up in her old room, making sure she had everything she needed. He fielded phone calls from neighbors and friends, all of them expressing outrage and support. News of the assault had spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire, and for the first time in memory, people were whispering against the Whitmore family. But the Whitmores were not idle. The day after Lily came home, the local newspaper ran a story with the headline, "Senator's Son Accused of Assault. Questions Emerge About Accuser's Credibility." The article, clearly planted by the Whitmore PR machine, suggested that Lily had been romantically involved with Bradley and that the incident was a lover's quarrel gone wrong. It quoted anonymous sources saying Lily was known to be dramatic and attention-seeking. Frank read the article at his kitchen table, his coffee growing cold beside him. By the time he finished, his hands were shaking with rage. "They're lying," Lily said from the doorway, her voice small. "Dad, I barely knew him. I said hello to him once at the grocery store months ago. That's it." "I know, sweetheart." Frank set down the paper. "I know." The phone rang. Frank answered it to find Martha Collins on the line, the town's unofficial gossip queen, but also one of its most loyal residents. "Frank," Martha said breathlessly, "you need to get down to the town hall. There's a meeting happening. People are talking about what happened to Lily, and things are getting heated." Frank hesitated, looking at his daughter. She nodded, her jaw set with determination. "Go, Dad," she said. "I'll be fine. It's time someone spoke up." Frank drove to town hall with his heart pounding. The parking lot was already full, cars and trucks lining the street in both directions. Inside, the main meeting room was packed with people, standing room only, their voices creating a buzz of conversation that fell silent when Frank walked through the door. Sheriff Willis stood at the front of the room, looking uncomfortable. Beside him was Mayor Patricia Hartley, a Whitmore ally who had held her position for 12 years. And in the front row, arms crossed and expression defiant, sat Senator Richard Whitmore himself. "Frank," Sheriff Willis said, clearly relieved to have somewhere to direct attention. "Good, you're here. We were just discussing the situation." Frank walked down the center aisle, feeling every eye in the room on him. He stopped directly in front of the senator, close enough to see the calculation in the man's blue eyes. "Senator," Frank said evenly, "your son assaulted my daughter, broke her wrist, left bruises all over her, and now I'm reading in the paper that she's a liar, and I'm supposed to just accept it." Richard Whitmore rose slowly, buttoning his expensive suit jacket. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his smile practiced and warm. The consummate politician. "Frank," he said, extending his hand, "I'm so sorry about this whole situation. Bradley is devastated. This has all been a terrible misunderstanding." Frank did not take the offered hand. "A misunderstanding," he repeated flatly. "Is that what you're calling it?" The senator's smile flickered. "Bradley admits he had too much to drink that night. He may have been too forward with your daughter, but assault, that's a very serious accusation, Frank, one that could destroy a young man's future." "My daughter's wrist is broken in 2 places, Frank said, his voice rising. "She has fingerprint bruises on her neck where your son grabbed her. She's afraid to leave the house. That's not too forward." "That's assault." A murmur ran through the crowd. Frank saw heads nodding, saw the anger in people's eyes. He was not alone in this. Senator Whitmore's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Frank," he said, lowering his voice, "let's be reasonable here. We can make this right. There's no need for courts and lawyers and public spectacles. Think about your daughter. Think about what a trial would do to her. The scrutiny, the questions, the publicity. Is that really what you want for Lily?" Frank felt something snap inside him. "What I want," he said loudly, turning to address the entire room, "is justice. What I want is for my daughter to be able to walk down the street without fear. What I want is for your son to face the consequences of his actions like any other citizen of this town would." "Now, Frank," Mayor Hartley began, but she was drowned out by shouts of agreement from the crowd. An older man in overalls stepped forward. "Frank's right," he said. "I've been watching the Whitmores get away with things for 40 years. My father watched it before me. When does it stop?" A woman in the back raised her voice. "Bradley Whitmore ran my mailbox over last month, drunk as a skunk. I called the sheriff and nothing happened. Nothing." More voices joined in, a chorus of grievances long suppressed. Stories poured out, tales of the Whitmore family using their power and influence to escape accountability. Frank watched as the senator's confident expression began to crack, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Sheriff Willis held up his hands. "Folks, please, let's calm down. This is a legal matter, and it will be handled through proper channels." "Will it?" Frank asked. "Will it really, Tom? Or will it be like all the other times? A slap on the wrist, a quiet settlement, and everyone pretends nothing happened?" Tom Willis met his eyes, and Frank saw the conflict there. The sheriff was caught between his duty and his dependence on Whitmore money and influence. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then Tom Willis straightened his shoulders and turned to face the senator. "Richard," he said, his voice steady, "Bradley is still in custody. I'm recommending that the prosecutor move forward with felony assault charges. Your lawyers can argue about bail and trial dates, but this is going through the system, the right way." Senator Whitmore's face turned red. "Tom, you can't be serious. Think about what you're doing." "I am thinking," the sheriff replied. "I'm thinking about the oath I took. I'm thinking about my badge and what it's supposed to mean. I'm thinking about Lily Morrison, who did nothing wrong except walk home from work." The room erupted in applause. Frank felt hands clapping his back, saw faces swimming with tears and triumph. For the first time in his life, he watched the Whitmore family face something they could not control. But even as hope bloomed in his chest, Frank saw the cold fury in Senator Whitmore's eyes. This was not over, not by a long shot. That night, Frank sat on his porch long after Lily had gone to bed, staring out at the darkness. The stars were hidden behind clouds, and a cold wind blew down from the mountains, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and distant rain. He thought about everything that had happened, everything that was still to come. The Whitmores were powerful, connected, ruthless. They had lawyers and money and political influence that Frank could not begin to match. Going up against them was like standing in front of an oncoming train with nothing but a flashlight. But what was the alternative? Let Bradley Whitmore walk free? Let his daughter's assault be swept under the rug like so many others before it? Let the message go out that the rich and powerful could do whatever they wanted to ordinary people like the Morrisons? No. Frank shook his head in the darkness. No, that was not acceptable. That would never be acceptable. He remembered something Margaret used to say back when they were young and full of dreams. She used to say that the measure of a person was not what they did when things were easy, but what they did when things were hard. Anyone could be brave when there was nothing to lose. True courage meant standing up when everything was on the line. Frank had never thought of himself as particularly courageous. He was just a truck driver, a working man who kept his head down and did his job. But Margaret had seen something in him, something he had not seen in himself. And now Lily was looking at him with the same trust, the same belief that he would do the right thing. He could not let either of them down. The next morning, Frank was up before dawn, making phone calls and knocking on doors. He started with the people he knew best, the neighbors and friends who had been part of his life for decades. He told them what had happened to Lily, told them about the Whitmore family's attempts to silence them, and asked for their support. The response was overwhelming. Nearly everyone he spoke to had a story about the Whitmores, a grievance they had been nursing for years. The family had bought up half the businesses in town, squeezing out local owners. They had blocked development projects that would have helped working families. They had used their influence to get out of traffic tickets, building code violations, and worse. "You're not alone in this, Frank," said Jim Patterson, who ran the hardware store on Main Street. "The Whitmores have been pushing people around for too long. It's time someone pushed back." By the end of the first day, Frank had a list of 50 names, people who were willing to stand with him publicly. By the end of the week, that number had grown to 200. They organized meetings at the church, at the community center, at people's homes. They shared information and resources. They planned strategies and backup strategies. Frank discovered that he had a talent for organizing, for bringing people together around a common cause. Years of managing his own trucking schedule had taught him how to coordinate complex logistics. Years of dealing with difficult customers had taught him how to communicate clearly and persuasively. These skills, which had seemed so ordinary in his daily life, became powerful tools in the fight against the Whitmores. But the family was not idle. Within days of Frank's organizing efforts, the Whitmores launched their own campaign. The next few weeks were the most difficult of Frank's life. True to his word, Sheriff Willis pushed the case forward, and Bradley Whitmore was formally charged with felony assault. The news hit the national media like a bomb, with headlines screaming about the senator's son and the small-town scandal. Reporters descended on Cedar Falls, setting up cameras on Main Street and knocking on doors looking for interviews. Frank refused all requests. Lily refused all requests. They kept their heads down, went about their daily lives as best they could, and tried to weather the storm. But the Whitmores fought back with everything they had. Their lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to get the charges dismissed or reduced. They hired a PR firm that planted stories questioning Lily's character, suggesting she was motivated by money or fame. They pressured businesses to cut ties with anyone who supported the Morrisons. Frank lost his contract with his main hauling company, a firm that had employed him for 15 years. The owner called him personally, apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry, Frank," he said. "The Whitmores are threatening to pull their shipping business if I keep you on. That's 30% of my revenue. I can't afford it." Frank understood. He did not blame the man, but it did not make the situation any less dire. Without income, he would burn through his savings in a matter of months. Other people were not so kind. Frank found his truck with slashed tires one morning, a note on the windshield telling him to drop the case or face worse. Anonymous calls came at all hours, threatening voices warning him to back off. Someone threw a brick through the library window with Lily's name painted on it. Through it all, Frank refused to waver, and slowly the town began to rally around him. It started with small things, neighbors showing up with casseroles and offers of help, local businesses giving Frank work on the side, odd jobs that kept money coming in. The owner of the diner, Martha Collins, put up a collection jar on her counter, and within a week it held over $2,000. Then the big things started happening. A law firm from Richmond reached out, offering to represent Lily pro bono. They were a prestigious outfit, partners in expensive suits who looked completely out of place in Frank's modest living room. But their lead attorney, a woman named Rachel Chen, spoke with a passion that cut through all the polish. "I've been watching this case," she told Frank and Lily. "What the Whitmores are doing is exactly why people don't trust the justice system. They think they can buy their way out of anything. I want to prove them wrong." With professional legal representation, the case moved forward more smoothly. Rachel and her team documented every instance of witness intimidation, every planted story, every dirty trick the Whitmores tried to pull. They built a case not just against Bradley, but against the entire system of corruption that had protected the family for generations. The trial was set for October. As the date approached, Cedar Falls transformed into something Frank barely recognized. Signs appeared in windows and on lawns. Justice for Lily. T-shirts were printed, bumper stickers distributed. The high school football team dedicated their season to Lily, painting her name on their helmets. Churches held prayer vigils. The volunteer fire department organized a fundraiser. But it was not just about Lily anymore. It was about everything the Whitmores had done, every injustice people had swallowed, every time they had looked the other way, because it was easier than fighting. Lily's case had become a symbol, a line in the sand. "Dad," Lily said one evening, looking out the window at the crowds gathered on their lawn, holding candles and singing songs of solidarity, "I never wanted any of this. I just wanted him to be held accountable." Frank stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "I know, sweetheart, but sometimes one person standing up gives other people the courage to stand up too. That's not your burden to carry. It's your gift to them." The trial began on a crisp October morning, the courthouse steps packed with spectators and reporters. Frank held Lily's hand as they walked through the crowd, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions. Rachel Chen walked ahead of them, clearing a path, her face calm and determined. The crowd that had gathered was unlike anything Cedar Falls had ever seen. People had come from neighboring counties, from across the state, from as far away as Washington, D.C. They carried signs with Lily's name, with messages of support and solidarity. They chanted and sang, their voices rising into the clear autumn sky. Frank saw faces he recognized and faces he did not. He saw old men and young women, families with children, teenagers who had skipped school to be there. He saw veterans in their military jackets, nurses in their scrubs, teachers and farmers and factory workers. Cedar Falls had become a symbol, and people wanted to be part of what was happening. Inside, the courtroom was standing room only. Frank saw familiar faces everywhere, neighbors, friends, people he had known his whole life. He also saw strangers, people who had driven from across the state to show their support, and in the front row, on the other side of the aisle, he saw Senator Richard Whitmore, his face a mask of controlled rage. The senator had aged visibly in the weeks since the incident. His silver hair seemed thinner, his face more lined. The confident, polished politician who had addressed rallies and town halls for decades now looked like a man facing his own mortality. His political career, his legacy, everything he had built over a lifetime was on the line. Bradley Whitmore sat at the defense table, flanked by a team of expensive lawyers. He had cleaned up for the trial, his hair neatly cut, his suit perfectly tailored. But Frank could see the arrogance in his eyes, the belief that he was untouchable. Even now, facing felony charges, the senator's son seemed to think this was all a game he would ultimately win. The lead defense attorney was a man named Harrison Blackwell, a legendary trial lawyer from Richmond who had defended corporate executives and political figures for 30 years. He was known for his ruthlessness, his ability to destroy witnesses on cross-examination, his willingness to use any tactic to secure a victory. The Whitmores had spared no expense. The prosecution was led by the district attorney, a woman named Catherine Harris, who had never tried a case this high profile. But Rachel Chen sat beside her at the counsel table, whispering advice, passing notes, providing the expertise and support that would prove crucial in the days ahead. The judge was the Honorable Marcus Washington, a former Marine who had served on the bench for 22 years. He was known for his fairness, his no-nonsense demeanor, and his absolute intolerance for courtroom theatrics. Both sides had agreed to him because neither could claim he was biased. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Washington began, addressing the packed courtroom. We are here today for the trial of Bradley Richard Whitmore on charges of felony assault. This is a court of law, not a circus. I expect decorum from everyone in this room. Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed. He looked around the courtroom, his gaze stern and unyielding. Counsel, you may proceed with opening statements. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They presented medical evidence of Lily's injuries, photographs that made several jurors visibly wince. They called witnesses who had seen Bradley drinking at the bar that night, who had heard him making threats. They played security camera footage from a nearby store that showed Bradley grabbing Lily, showed her struggling to break free. Catherine Harris spoke with quiet passion, painting a picture of a privileged young man who believed the rules did not apply to him. The evidence will show, she said, that Bradley Whitmore targeted Lily Morrison because he believed he could get away with it. He believed that his family's money and power made him untouchable. He was wrong, and now he must face the consequences of his actions, just like any other citizen of this community. Harrison Blackwell's opening statement was a masterpiece of misdirection. He did not deny that an altercation had occurred. Instead, he reframed the entire incident as a misunderstanding, a moment of confusion that had been blown out of proportion by political enemies of the Whitmore family. Bradley Whitmore, he said, pacing before the jury, is not a monster. He's a young man who made a mistake. He had too much to drink. He misread signals. When he realized his error, he backed off immediately. But by then, the damage was done, not to Lily Morrison, whose injuries, while regrettable, are far less severe than the prosecution would have you believe. The damage was done to Bradley's reputation, to his family's standing in this community, to the fabric of this town itself. Frank felt his hands clench into fists. Beside him, Lily placed a calming hand on his arm. "He's trying to make this about us," she whispered. "About dividing the town. Don't let him get to you." Frank nodded, forcing himself to relax. His daughter was right. This was a marathon, not a sprint. They had to stay focused on the goal. Lily took the stand on the third day. Frank watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and heartbreak as she recounted what had happened that night. Her voice trembled sometimes, but she never wavered. She answered every question directly, even the cruel ones from the defense attorney who tried to paint her as a liar and a seductress. Harrison Blackwell was merciless in his cross-examination. He questioned every detail of Lily's account, looking for inconsistencies, trying to confuse and intimidate her. He brought up her social media posts, her friendships, even her grades in college, trying to paint a picture of a young woman who was unreliable and attention-seeking. "Is it not true, Miss Morrison," he said, approaching the witness stand with a predatory smile, "that you had spoken with Bradley Whitmore on multiple occasions before the night in question?" Lily did not flinch. "I said hello to him once, at the grocery store, several months before. That's it." "Once?" Blackwell raised an eyebrow. "Are you certain about that?" "I'm certain, and yet we have witnesses who will testify that they saw you speaking with Bradley at Mulligan's bar just 2 weeks before the incident. How do you explain that?" Rachel Chen was on her feet immediately. "Objection. The defense is mischaracterizing testimony that has not yet been introduced." "Sustained," Judge Washington said. "Mr. Blackwell, you know better. Stick to the facts in evidence." Blackwell smiled, unruffled. Withdrawn, he turned back to Lily. "Miss Morrison, you claim that Bradley Whitmore assaulted you without provocation. Is that correct?" "Yes. No flirting, no suggestive behavior, no indication whatsoever that you might be interested in his attention." "None." Blackwell paused, letting the silence stretch. He paced in front of the jury, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Morrison," he said finally, "is it possible that you misinterpreted the situation? That what you perceived as assault was actually a clumsy attempt at romance?" Lily's eyes blazed. "He grabbed me by the arm, hard enough to leave bruises. When I tried to pull away, he grabbed my wrist and twisted it until it broke. There was nothing romantic about it. And yet you say you barely knew him. Why would he do such a thing to a stranger? I don't know, Lily said, her voice steady. You would have to ask him. Blackwell returned to the defense table, shuffling papers. But the prosecution was ready with redirect. Miss Morrison, Catherine Harris said gently, can you describe for the jury exactly what happened when Bradley Whitmore approached you that night? Lily took a deep breath. I was walking home from work, she began. It was around 9:30. The library closes at 9, and I always stay a few minutes late to make sure everything is locked up. I was walking down Oak Street toward my father's house when I heard someone behind me. She paused, her hands trembling slightly. I turned around, and Bradley Whitmore was there. He was drunk. I could smell it on him. He said something like, "Hey, beautiful, where are you going?" I told him I was going home. He said, "Come on, don't be like that. Let me give you a ride." What did you say? Catherine Harris asked. I said, "No, thank you." I said I was fine. I tried to keep walking, but he grabbed my arm. Can you show the jury where he grabbed you? Lily rolled up her sleeve, revealing the faded bruises that still marked her upper arm. He squeezed hard. She continued. I told him to let go. He laughed. He said, "You Morrison girls think you're too good for everyone." He said other things I don't want to repeat. You don't have to, Catherine said. What happened next? I tried to pull away. I kicked him in the shin. He got angry, really angry. He grabbed my wrist with both hands and twisted. I felt something crack. I screamed. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Several jurors had tears in their eyes. Then, what happened? Catherine prompted. A car turned onto the street. The headlights must have startled him because he let go. I ran all the way to the police station. I didn't stop until I was inside. Catherine nodded. One more question, Miss Morrison. When Bradley Whitmore grabbed you, when he twisted your wrist, when he said those things to you, did you feel afraid for your safety? Lily looked directly at the jury, her eyes clear and unflinching. I thought he was going to kill me, she said simply. I really did. I was walking home from work, Lily said, her eyes fixed on the jury. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't dressed provocatively. I was just a girl trying to get home. And Bradley Whitmore decided that he had the right to put his hands on me. He was wrong. The courtroom was silent when she finished. Several jurors were wiping their eyes. The defense called their own witnesses, character witnesses for Bradley, who spoke of his community service and his bright future. They brought in experts who questioned the severity of Lily's injuries. They tried every trick in the book to create doubt. One by one, Bradley's friends took the stand to testify about his good character. They spoke of his volunteer work at the local food bank, his donations to charity, his plans to attend law school and follow in his father's footsteps. Bradley is one of the kindest people I know, said a young woman named Melissa Thornton, a childhood friend of the Whitmore family. He would never hurt anyone. This whole thing is a misunderstanding. But Rachel Chen was relentless in her cross-examinations. She exposed the lies, highlighted the inconsistencies, and painted a picture of a privileged young man who had never faced consequences for anything in his life. Miss Thornton, she said, approaching the witness with a thick folder in her hands, you say Bradley Whitmore is kind. Is that correct? Yes. And he would never hurt anyone? Never. Rachel opened the folder. Then can you explain this police report from 2019 when Bradley was arrested for assaulting a waiter at a restaurant in Richmond? Or this one from 2020 when he was accused of pushing a classmate down a flight of stairs at his fraternity? Melissa's face went pale. Those charges were dropped. Yes, they were. After the Whitmore family made substantial donations to the victims and their families. She turned to the jury. Do you know how much money the Whitmores paid to make those charges disappear, Miss Thornton? Objection, Harrison Blackwell shouted. Relevance. I'll allow it, Judge Washington said. The witness may answer. I don't know, Melissa said quietly. Let me help you. Rachel pulled out another document. $50,000 in the first case, $75,000 in the second, over $100,000 to make sure that Bradley Whitmore never had to face consequences for his actions. She turned to face the jury directly. "This is not the first time Bradley Whitmore has hurt someone. It's just the first time his family couldn't make it go away." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Judge Washington banged his gavel. "Order," he commanded. "Order in the court." But the damage was done. The defense's carefully constructed narrative was crumbling. The trial continued for another week. More witnesses were called, more evidence presented. The defense tried to recover, bringing in a parade of experts to question everything from the medical evidence to the reliability of the security camera footage. But the prosecution had one more card to play. On the 9th day of the trial, Catherine Harris stood before the court with a look of grim satisfaction. "Your Honor," she said, "the prosecution calls one final witness. We call Bradley Whitmore." A murmur swept through the courtroom. It was unusual for a defendant to take the stand, but Bradley's lawyers had decided it was their only hope. They needed the jury to see Bradley as a person, not a monster. Bradley walked to the witness stand with the confident stride of a man who had never doubted himself. He was sworn in, adjusted his tie, and flashed a practiced smile at the jury. Harrison Blackwell handled the direct examination, lobbing softball questions that allowed Bradley to paint himself as a misunderstood young man who had simply made a mistake. "I never meant to hurt her," Bradley said, his voice dripping with rehearsed sincerity. "I had too much to drink that night. I made some bad decisions. When I saw Lily walking alone, I just wanted to talk to her. I thought she was pretty, and I guess I was too forward. When I realized she wasn't interested, I backed off. But by then, she was upset, and, well, here we are." "And the injuries?" Blackwell asked. "Her broken wrist? The bruises?" Bradley shook his head sadly. "I honestly don't know how those happened. Maybe she fell while she was running away. Maybe she hurt herself somehow. But I never intentionally hurt her. I would never do that. It was a smooth performance, polished and convincing." But then it was Catherine Harris's turn. She approached the witness stand slowly, studying Bradley like a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, "you say you never intentionally hurt Lily Morrison. Is that correct?" "That's right. And you say the injuries she sustained might have happened some other way. Perhaps she fell?" "It's possible." Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "Then how do you explain the security camera footage that clearly shows you grabbing her arm, pulling her toward you, and twisting her wrist?" Bradley's composure flickered. "That footage is grainy. You can't really tell what's happening. Actually, our video enhancement expert testified that the footage is quite clear. Clear enough to see your hands around her wrist. Clear enough to see her struggling. Clear enough to see the exact moment her wrist breaks." She turned to the jury. "Would you like me to play that footage again, Mr. Whitmore? Would you like the jury to watch it one more time and decide for themselves what happened?" Bradley's face reddened. "That won't be necessary." "I didn't think so." Catherine consulted her notes. "Mr. Whitmore, you mentioned that you had been drinking that night. How much exactly? I don't remember." "You don't remember. But the bartender at Mulligan's testified that you consumed 7 whiskeys over the course of 3 hours. Does that sound accurate?" "Maybe. I wasn't counting. 7 whiskeys. And then you decided to approach a young woman walking alone at night." "I was just trying to talk to her at 9:30 at night on a deserted street after consuming 7 whiskeys." Bradley said nothing. Catherine moved closer to the witness stand. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice hardening, "you said earlier that you backed off when you realized Lily wasn't interested. But the security footage shows you grabbing her arm. Why did you do that?" "I don't know. I wasn't thinking clearly. You weren't thinking clearly because you had consumed 7 whiskeys." "Yes. And when she tried to pull away? When she struggled against your grip? What were you thinking then?" I don't remember." "You don't remember." Catherine's voice rose. "You don't remember grabbing a young woman's arm. You don't remember her struggling. You don't remember breaking her wrist. That's very convenient, Mr. Whitmore." "Objection," Blackwell said weakly, badgering the witness. "Withdrawn," Catherine said. She turned back to Bradley. One final question, Mr. Whitmore. You testified that you would never intentionally hurt anyone, but we've heard evidence today of at least 2 previous incidents where you were accused of assault. In both cases, the charges were dropped after your family paid off the victims. What do you say to that? Bradley's practiced composure finally cracked. He leaned forward, his face twisted with anger. Those people were liars, he spat, just like Lily Morrison. They saw an opportunity to get money from my family and they took it. That's all this is. A shakedown. A setup. A setup? Catherine asked, her eyebrows rising. Yes. Bradley glared at his father's enemies in the gallery. My family has been targeted by political opponents for years. This whole thing is just another attempt to bring us down. So you're saying that Lily Morrison, a 20-year-old library worker, is part of a political conspiracy against your family? I'm saying she saw an opportunity and she took it, just like the others. Catherine turned to face the jury, letting Bradley's words hang in the air. No further questions, she said. The damage was devastating. Bradley had revealed himself not as a misunderstood young man, but as an entitled, arrogant person who blamed everyone but himself for his problems. The jury watched him walk back to the defense table, their expressions cold. Harrison Blackwell's closing argument was a masterpiece of legal rhetoric, but it could not undo what Bradley had done on the stand. The prosecution's closing was simple and direct. A privileged young man had assaulted an innocent woman, and the evidence proved it beyond any reasonable doubt. But Rachel Chen was relentless in her cross-examinations. She exposed the lies, highlighted the inconsistencies, and painted a picture of a privileged young man who had never faced consequences for anything in his life. The trial lasted 2 weeks. When it was over, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Frank felt Lily collapse against him, sobbing with relief. Around them, people were cheering, crying, hugging each other. On the other side of the aisle, Senator Whitmore sat frozen, his face drained of color. Bradley Whitmore was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. As the bailiffs led him away, he looked back at Lily, with hatred in his eyes. But she did not flinch. She met his gaze steadily until the doors closed behind him. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown to hundreds. When Frank and Lily emerged, a roar went up that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. People were waving signs, chanting Lily's name, celebrating a victory that felt like it belonged to everyone. Frank found himself surrounded by reporters, microphones thrust in his face, questions flying from all directions. He held up his hand for silence, and the crowd gradually quieted. "My daughter," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd, "is the bravest person I know. She stood up when it would have been easier to stay silent. She fought when powerful people wanted her to give up. And today, justice was done. Not because we're rich or powerful, but because we're right. That's how it's supposed to work in this country. That's how it's going to work from now on." The crowd erupted again. Frank felt Lily squeeze his hand, and he looked down at her tear-streaked face. "Mom would be proud," she whispered. Frank nodded, his own eyes filling with tears. She would be. She really would be. The aftermath of the trial rippled far beyond Cedar Falls. Senator Richard Whitmore's presidential ambitions evaporated overnight. Investigations were launched into the family's business dealings, uncovering decades of fraud and corruption. The senator announced he would not seek re-election, citing a desire to spend more time with family. But the real change happened in the town itself. Sheriff Tom Willis was re-elected by a landslide, running on a platform of equal justice for all. Mayor Hartley was voted out, replaced by a young woman named Sarah Chen, no relation to the lawyer, who had organized many of the protests during the trial. Frank got his trucking contract back, along with an apology from the company owner. More importantly, he got something he had not had in years: peace. The constant anxiety that had been his companion since Margaret's death began to fade, replaced by a quiet contentment. Lily returned to Virginia Tech for her senior year, graduating with honors the following spring. She went on to law school, inspired by Rachel Chen's example, determined to fight for others who could not fight for themselves. On the one-year anniversary of the verdict, the town of Cedar Falls unveiled a new monument in the square. It was a simple bronze statue of a young woman standing tall, her face turned toward the sunrise. At its base, a plaque read, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. In honor of all who stand up." Frank stood in the crowd as the sheet was pulled away, Lily beside him, her hand in his. Tears streamed down his face, but he did not try to hide them. He was not ashamed of his emotions anymore, was not afraid to be seen. A reporter approached him afterward, notepad in hand. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "what would you say to other families facing similar situations?" "Families who feel powerless against people with money and influence." Frank thought for a moment. "I'd say this," he replied. "The powerful want you to believe that you can't win. They want you to feel small, insignificant, invisible. But that's a lie. Every single one of us has a voice. Every single one of us matters. And when we stand together, when we refuse to be silent, there's nothing they can do to stop us." He paused, looking out at the crowd gathered in the square, at the faces of his neighbors and friends, at the town that had come together in its darkest hour. "They tried to break my daughter," Frank continued. "They tried to break all of us. But we're still standing. And we'll keep standing as long as it takes. That's what it means to be a community. That's what it means to be Americans." The reporter nodded, scribbling notes. "And what about the Whitmores? Do you feel any satisfaction in their downfall?" Frank shook his head. "I don't take pleasure in anyone's suffering, not even theirs. But I do believe in accountability. I believe that no one is above the law, no matter how rich or powerful they are. Bradley Whitmore hurt my daughter. He faced consequences. That's justice. That's all I ever wanted." He turned to look at Lily, who was surrounded by well-wishers, her face radiant with joy. And that's all she ever wanted too, not revenge, not money, just to be heard, just to be believed. The reporter thanked him and moved on. Frank stood alone for a moment, watching the celebration unfold around him. He thought about Margaret, about what she would have made of all this. She had always believed in the goodness of people, in the power of community to overcome adversity. She would have been proud of Lily, proud of Frank, proud of the town they called home. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to find Rachel Chen standing beside him, her usual professional demeanor softened by a warm smile. "You did good, Frank," she said. "Not just for Lily, for everyone." Frank shook his head. "I just did what any father would do. You're the one who made it happen," Rachel laughed. "It was a team effort. And speaking of which, Lily mentioned she's applying to law schools. Any chance you can convince her to consider Richmond? We could use someone with her courage." Frank grinned. "I'll put in a good word. But you know Lily. She makes her own decisions." "That's what I'm counting on." They shook hands, and Rachel disappeared into the crowd. Frank watched her go, then turned back to the monument, studying the bronze face that was and was not his daughter. "What now?" a voice asked beside him. Frank turned to find Sheriff Tom Willis, out of uniform for once, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt like any other resident of Cedar Falls. "Now," Frank said slowly, "we keep going. We keep watching out for each other. We keep standing up when something's wrong. That's all we can do." Tom nodded, his eyes fixed on the statue. "You know, when I let Bradley go that first night, I told myself I was being practical, keeping the peace, not rocking the boat." He paused. "I was a coward." "You made it right," Frank said. "When it counted, you did the right thing." "Only because you gave me no choice," Tom replied. "You and Lily. You showed me what courage looked like. I'll never forget that." They stood in silence for a while, two old friends who had been through something neither of them fully understood. Around them, the celebration continued, children running through the square, music playing from somewhere, laughter and conversation filling the autumn air. Frank thought about the long road that had brought him here, The endless miles behind the wheel of his truck, the lonely nights, the grief of losing Margaret, the fear of raising Lily alone. He had never thought of himself as a hero or even as particularly brave. He was just a man who loved his daughter and refused to let anyone hurt her. But maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what courage really was. Not the absence of fear, like the plaque said, but the willingness to act despite it. The willingness to stand up even when the odds were against you, even when powerful forces wanted you to stay silent. Frank had learned something important over the past year. He had learned that ordinary people doing ordinary things could change the world. Not all at once, but little by little, one act of courage at a time. A father refusing to back down, a daughter speaking her truth, a sheriff remembering his oath, a lawyer fighting for justice. A town coming together. That was the real lesson of what had happened in Cedar Falls. Not that justice always prevailed, because it did not. Not that good always triumphed over evil, because that was far too simple. But that when people stood together, when they refused to be silent, when they demanded better from themselves and each other, things could change. It was not easy. It was never going to be easy. But it was possible, and sometimes possible was enough. Lily appeared at his side, slipping her arm through his. "Ready to go home, Dad?" Frank smiled, looking at the daughter who had made him prouder than he had ever thought possible. "Yeah, sweetheart. Let's go home." They walked together through the crowd, accepting handshakes and hugs along the way. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a beautiful evening in Cedar Falls, and Frank Morrison was exactly where he was supposed to be. Home, family, community. These were the things that mattered. These were the things worth fighting for, and Frank would keep fighting for them for as long as he drew breath. The weeks after the monument dedication brought a sense of normalcy to Cedar Falls that Frank had almost forgotten was possible. Lily came home for Thanksgiving, her first visit since returning to school, and Frank cooked the turkey himself, something he had not done since Margaret was alive. They sat at the kitchen table, just the two of them, the house filled with the smells of roasting meat and homemade stuffing. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, dusting the yard in white. "This is nice," Lily said, looking around at the familiar walls, the photographs of Margaret, the old furniture that held so many memories. "I missed this." "I missed you too, sweetheart," Frank replied. "The house is too quiet without you." Lily smiled, but there was something pensive in her expression. "Dad, can I ask you something? Anything. Do you ever regret it, standing up to the Whitmores? I know it cost you a lot, your job, your peace of mind. You could have just let it go." Frank set down his fork and looked at his daughter. "Not for a second," he said firmly. "Not for one single second. What Bradley did to you was wrong. Letting him get away with it would have been worse. Sometimes the right thing is the hard thing. That's just how it is. But what if we had lost? What if the jury had believed their lies? Then we would have lost knowing we fought," Frank said, "knowing we didn't roll over. There's a kind of peace in that, Lily, the peace of knowing you did everything you could." Lily nodded slowly. "That's what I keep telling myself, about law school, about the future. There are going to be cases I lose, people I can't help. But if I give up, if I stop fighting, then they win anyway." Frank felt a surge of pride so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. "You sound like your mother," he said, his voice thick. "She always said the same thing. The fight is what matters, the willingness to show up day after day, even when the odds are against you." "I wish she could see this," Lily whispered. "See what we did." "She can," Frank said with certainty. "Wherever she is, she sees it all, and she's proud of you. Prouder than you'll ever know." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, then moved to the living room to watch the snow fall. Frank built a fire in the old stone fireplace, something he had not done in years, and they sat together on the worn couch, wrapped in blankets, watching the flames dance. "Tell me about Mom," Lily said suddenly, "about when you first met." Frank smiled, settling back into the cushions. It was at a county fair, if you can believe it, summer of 1989. I was working the parking lot, directing traffic, and this beautiful girl walked past with her friends, red hair just like yours. I couldn't take my eyes off her. Was it love at first sight? For me it was. Your mother took a little more convincing. He chuckled. I asked her to dance 3 times before she said yes. She told me later she wanted to see if I was persistent. She said persistence was the most important quality a person could have. Lily laughed. That sounds like her. We danced 4 songs in a row, Frank continued, his eyes distant with memory. And by the end of the night, I knew I was going to marry her. Took me 2 years to convince her of that, but I was persistent. And the rest is history, Lily said, the best kind of history. Frank looked at his daughter, seeing Margaret's eyes, Margaret's smile, Margaret's spirit. She would be so proud of you, Lily. Everything you've accomplished, everything you're going to accomplish. I just want to help people, Dad, like she did, like you did, then you will. I have no doubt about that. They sat together until the fire burned low, talking about the past and the future, about memories and dreams. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in a blanket of white, washing away the ugliness and leaving only peace. When Lily finally went to bed, Frank sat alone in the darkened living room, watching the last embers glow. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the pain and the fear and the triumph. He thought about Margaret, about the life they had built together and the legacy she had left behind. And he thought about the future, about Lily's career in law, about the people she would help, the battles she would fight. About Cedar Falls and the changes that were coming, the new generation that would carry forward the lessons of the past. The world was not perfect. It never would be. There would always be Whitmores, always be people who believed their money and power put them above the law. There would always be injustice, always be struggles, always be reasons to give up. But there would also always be people like Lily, people who refused to be silent, people who stood up even when it was hard, even when the odds were against them, people who believed that the fight was worth fighting, no matter the cost. That was the hope. That was the promise. That was what Frank Morrison had learned in the hardest year of his life. He rose from the couch and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered yard. In the distance he could see the lights of Cedar Falls twinkling through the storm, a small beacon in the darkness. Tomorrow there would be work to do, trucks to drive, bills to pay, life to live. But tonight, Frank allowed himself a moment of peace, a moment of gratitude for the daughter he loved, for the community that had supported them, for the justice they had fought for and won. The snow continued to fall, silent and steady, covering the world in white. Frank Morrison smiled and went to bed. 2 years later, Frank sat in the audience at Georgetown Law School's graduation ceremony, watching Lily walk across the stage to receive her diploma. She moved with confidence now, all traces of the frightened girl from the hospital gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own strength, who had been tested and found unbreakable. The crowd applauded as Lily shook the dean's hand, and Frank felt tears streaming down his face. He did not try to hide them. He was not ashamed of his emotions anymore. Beside him sat Tom Willis, retired now, but still as sharp as ever. Rachel Chen was there too, along with 6 other people from Cedar Falls who had made the trip to Washington for this moment. "Your girl done good," Tom said, clapping Frank on the back. "She did," Frank agreed. "She really did." After the ceremony, they gathered outside on the lawn, taking photographs and exchanging hugs. Lily was radiant in her cap and gown, surrounded by classmates and professors who all seemed to want a moment of her time. Finally, she broke away and came to Frank, wrapping her arms around him in a fierce embrace. "I did it, Dad," she whispered. "I really did it." "Never doubted you for a second," Frank replied. They stood together, father and daughter, looking out at the future that stretched before them. It was a beautiful spring day in Washington, the cherry blossoms in full bloom, the sky a brilliant blue. "So what now?" Frank asked. "Rachel's job offer still on the table?" Lily nodded. "I start next month. They're putting me on a civil rights case right away. Family in rural Alabama, fighting a corporation that's been polluting their water supply. Sound familiar?" Frank laughed. "Just a little. I learned from the best." Lily squeezed his hand. "You taught me what it means to stand up for what's right. To fight even when it's hard. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to live up to that example." Frank shook his head. "You already have, sweetheart. You already have." They walked together across the lawn, leaving the celebration behind, heading toward whatever came next. The future was uncertain, as it always was, but Frank was not afraid. His daughter was strong, his community was strong, and the lessons they had learned together would endure. The senator's son had hurt a trucker's daughter. What happened next had brought the whole town to a standstill. But in the stillness, something new had been born, a determination, a solidarity, a belief that ordinary people standing together could change the world. Frank Morrison had spent his life driving the highways of America, hauling freight from one place to another, invisible to most of the people he passed. But he was not invisible anymore. Neither was his daughter, neither was Cedar Falls. They had stood up, they had spoken out, they had demanded justice, and they had won. Not because they were special, not because they were heroes, but because they refused to give up. Because they believed that the fight was worth fighting, no matter the cost. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. That was what Frank Morrison would pass on to his grandchildren someday, if he was lucky enough to have them. The powerful want you to believe that you can't win. But that's a lie. Every single one of us has a voice. Every single one of us matters, and when we stand together, there's nothing they can do to stop us. Frank and Lily reached the car, and Frank held the door for his daughter, just as he had done 1,000 times before. "Ready?" he asked. Lily smiled, her mother's smile bright and full of hope. "Ready," she said. Frank started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward home. The road stretched before them, endless and full of possibility, and somewhere in Virginia, in a small town called Cedar Falls, a bronze statue of a young woman stood in the square, her face turned toward the sunrise, waiting for the next person who needed to know that courage was possible, that standing up was possible, that winning was possible. All you had to do was try. All you had to do was believe. All you had to do was refuse to give up. The Morrison family had learned that lesson the hard way, but they had learned it, and they would never forget. Neither would Cedar Falls, neither would the world. The story of the senator's son and the trucker's daughter had ended. But the story of what came next, the story of hope and courage and change, was just beginning. And it would be written by all of them together, one act of courage at a time, one voice raised in protest at a time, one person standing up at a time, until the world was different, until justice was real, until every father could protect his daughter, and every daughter could speak her truth, and every small town could stand against the powerful and win. That was the promise of Cedar Falls. That was the promise of America, and Frank Morrison, driving home with his daughter beside him, believed in that promise with all his heart. The highway unfolded before them, familiar and strange all at once. Home was waiting, the future was waiting. And they were ready. Finally, after everything, they were ready. The sun set behind the Blue Ridge Mountains as they crossed the county line, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. "Welcome to Cedar Falls," the sign read, population 8,247, and growing stronger every day. The months that followed the trial brought changes to Cedar Falls that no one could have predicted. The conviction of Bradley Whitmore had cracked open something in the town, a long-suppressed desire for accountability and fairness that now flowed freely through every aspect of community life. The first major change came to the town council. For decades, the Whitmore family had controlled the majority of seats through a combination of campaign donations and strategic alliances. But in the special election held 3 months after the verdict, 4 of the 5 incumbent members were voted out, replaced by candidates who had openly supported the Morrisons during the trial. Frank watched the election results come in from his living room, surrounded by neighbors and friends who had become like family over the past year. When the final tally was announced, a cheer went up that could probably be heard all the way to the Whitmore estate on the hill. "We did it," Martha Collins said, tears streaming down her face. "We actually did it." "No," Frank replied, looking around at the faces of the people who had stood with him through the darkest days. "We all did it, together." The new town council wasted no time making changes. They commissioned an independent audit of all contracts between the town and Whitmore-owned businesses, uncovering years of sweetheart deals and inflated prices. They reformed the police department's oversight procedures, ensuring that no one would ever again be given a pass because of their family name. They established a victim advocacy program, providing support and resources to anyone who had been affected by the Whitmore family's decades of impunity. But perhaps the most significant change was symbolic. The town council voted unanimously to rename the central square, which had been called Whitmore Plaza for 70 years. It would now be called Freedom Square, a testament to the ordinary citizens who had stood up against injustice and won. The dedication ceremony was held on a warm spring afternoon, exactly 1 year after Lily's assault. Frank stood at the podium, looking out at a crowd that seemed to include every resident of Cedar Falls, and then some. Behind him, the bronze statue of Lily stood tall against the blue sky, its face turned toward the sunrise. 1 year ago, Frank began, his voice carrying across the silent square, "My daughter was attacked by a man who thought his family name put him above the law. 1 year ago, I stood in this very spot and wondered if justice was even possible for people like us." He paused, letting the memory of that dark time wash over him. "I was wrong to doubt," he continued. "Not because justice was easy, it wasn't. Not because the powerful simply gave up their privilege. They didn't. But because I underestimated you, all of you, the people of Cedar Falls who refused to look away, who refused to be silent, who stood with my family when standing was dangerous and speaking was risky." He looked out at the faces before him, seeing tears and smiles in equal measure. This square used to carry a name that represented everything that was wrong with our town: privilege, entitlement, the belief that some people matter more than others. But now it carries a new name: freedom. And that name represents everything that is right about us, the belief that every person deserves justice, that no one is above the law, that when ordinary people stand together, there is nothing they cannot accomplish. The crowd erupted in applause. Frank stepped back from the podium, and Lily took his place. She had grown so much in the past year, Frank thought as he watched her. The frightened girl in the hospital bed was gone, replaced by a young woman who carried herself with quiet confidence. Her arm had healed completely, and while the emotional scars would take longer, she was well on her way to full recovery. "My father said it better than I ever could," Lily said, her voice clear and strong. "But I want to add one thing. What happened to me was terrible. I won't pretend otherwise. But something beautiful came out of it too. This community, this family we've built, this determination to make things better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us." She looked at the statue, at the bronze face that captured her likeness without capturing her essence. "This statue isn't really about me," she said. "It's about all of us. Every person who has ever been afraid to speak up, every person who has ever been told they don't matter, every person who has ever faced down power with nothing but the truth on their side. This statue says that we see you, we hear you, and we will stand with you no matter what." The ceremony continued with speeches from Sheriff Willis, from Rachel Chen, from Mayor Sarah Chen, from citizens who wanted to share what the past year had meant to them. But Frank barely heard any of it. He was lost in thoughts of Margaret, of how proud she would have been, of how much he wished she could have seen this day. As the sun began to set, the crowd gradually dispersed. Frank found himself standing alone before the statue, looking up at his daughter's bronze face. "We did it, Margaret," he whispered. "Our girl is going to be okay, better than okay. She's going to change the world." A hand slipped into his. He looked down to find Lily standing beside him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You talking to Mom?" she asked softly. Frank nodded. "Just telling her about the ceremony. I think she would have liked it." Lily leaned her head against his shoulder. "She's here, Dad. I can feel her. She's been here through all of it." They stood together in silence as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky. The statue seemed to glow in the twilight, a beacon of hope in a world that sorely needed one. The Whitmore estate sold 6 months later. Senator Richard Whitmore, his political career in ruins, his fortune depleted by legal fees and settlements, announced that he and his wife were relocating to Florida. The sprawling mansion that had dominated the hill above Cedar Falls for a century was purchased by a non-profit organization that turned it into a community center and job training facility. The irony was not lost on anyone. Bradley Whitmore served his full 5-year sentence. He was denied parole twice, once for getting into a fight with another inmate, and once for refusing to complete a mandatory anger management program. When he was finally released, he disappeared from public view entirely. Rumor had it he was living somewhere in South America, far from anyone who might recognize his name. Frank continued driving his truck, though he cut back his hours as the years went by. He no longer needed the escape that the open road had once provided. He had found something better, a community that loved him, a daughter who made him proud, a life filled with meaning and purpose. He became something of a local celebrity, though he never sought or wanted the attention. People would stop him on the street to thank him for what he had done, to tell him how his courage had inspired them to stand up for themselves or others. He always deflected the praise, pointing to Lily, to the community, to everyone except himself. "You know," Tom Willis told him one afternoon, as they sat on Frank's porch watching the sunset, "you're the most reluctant hero I've ever met." Frank shook his head. "I'm not a hero, Tom. I'm just a father who loves his daughter." "That's exactly what makes you a hero," Tom replied. "You didn't do it for glory or recognition. You did it because it was right. That's the definition of heroism, if you ask me." Frank considered this, then shrugged. "Maybe so, but I couldn't have done any of it without you, without Rachel, without this whole town. Heroes don't exist in isolation, Tom. They're created by the people who stand with them." Tom raised his beer in a toast. "To the people who stand together, then." Frank clinked his bottle against Tom's. "To standing together." The years continued to pass, marked by milestones both personal and communal. Lily graduated from law school and returned to Virginia to practice. She specialized in civil rights cases, fighting for victims who had been wronged by powerful institutions and individuals. Her reputation grew, and soon she was being quoted in national publications and invited to speak at conferences around the country. But she never forgot where she came from. She maintained an office in Cedar Falls, taking on local cases for free, mentoring young people who wanted to make a difference. She became a fixture at community events, always ready to lend her voice to causes that mattered. "Dad," she said one evening, as they sat together on his porch, "I've been thinking about the future." "Oh, yeah? What kind of thinking?" Lily hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I've been approached about running for office, state legislature to start, maybe more later." Frank studied his daughter's face in the fading light. "And what do you think about that?" I think I could do some good, not just for individual clients, but for everyone. The system needs to change, Dad, from the inside, and I know how to fight." Frank smiled, remembering the scared girl in the hospital, remembering the brave woman on the witness stand, remembering every step of the journey that had brought them here. "Then do it," he said. "Run for office. Change the system. Make them all afraid of you." Lily laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet yard. "I don't want them to be afraid of me. I just want them to be accountable." "Same thing," Frank said, and they both laughed. The election was held the following November. Lily ran on a platform of transparency, accountability, and justice for all. She won by the largest margin in the district's history. Frank stood in the crowd on election night, watching his daughter take the stage to deliver her victory speech. "Thank you," Lily said, her voice carrying across the packed room. "Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for believing that ordinary people can change the world." She paused, looking out at the crowd with the same steady gaze that had faced down Bradley Whitmore's lawyers. "Years ago, I was a girl walking home from work. I was attacked by a man who thought his family name made him untouchable. I thought my life was over, but it wasn't. It was just beginning. Because of you, because of this community." She smiled, and Frank saw Margaret in that smile. "Tonight, we begin a new chapter. A chapter where accountability is not a luxury but a right. This is our time, this is our moment, and we are just getting started." The crowd roared its approval. Frank felt tears streaming down his face. He thought about the journey that had brought them here. A senator's son had hurt a trucker's daughter. What happened next had brought the whole town to a standstill. But from that stillness, something new had emerged. A movement, a reckoning, a future where people like the Morrisons did not have to live in fear. The road stretched ahead, endless and full of possibility, and they would travel it together, 1 mile at a time, one act of courage at a time, until the world was different, until justice was real. That was the promise of Cedar Falls. That was the promise of America, and Frank Morrison believed in that promise with all his heart. Her family was going to be okay, better than okay. They were going to change the world.